Hey everyone, welcome to part 1 of my Project M Ivysaur guide. Today I'll be focusing on how to approach neutral. Just to be clear, when I say neutral, I mean this. Not this, or this, or this. All of these situations fall into what I'll be referring to as advantage, or disadvantage, and while I'll be talking about those in future videos, they aren't my focus for today's part of the guide. The goal of neutral is to win an interaction like this, where neither of you have a quantifiable advantage yet, and this video will hopefully help you think about how to do that effectively with Ivysaur. In order to talk about how to approach neutral with Ivy, first we need to quickly identify what her strengths and weaknesses are in neutral. Ivysaur has two main strengths, but is generally only able to utilize one of them at a time. First, she possesses some of the longest range normals in the game, allowing Ivy players to almost always beat out their opponent's moves or attempts to weave around her if you're able to predict where and when the opponent will be. Second, those moves are supplemented by a smaller number of tools that lack range but have extremely low startup, which allow her to challenge slow attacks on reaction using superior frame data. Together, these tools allow her to play an effective zoning game with the ability to weave between poorly spaced or timed attacks with fast moves of her own. However, that isn't to say that her moves aren't without flaws. Most of Ivysaur's kit is heavily susceptible to being punished through the use of crouch cancel, or shield, or both, meaning that selecting the right moves for the situation is extremely important. In a game as complex as Project M, there is no possible way to break down every one of the tiny decisions you have to make in each aspect of the game and how to respond to it. So instead, I'm going to try and give you the tools that you need to evaluate situations and choose the correct option based on what you know. For this video, I want to focus on decision making when you as a player think that using an attack of some kind is appropriate, since the nuances of movement, baiting, and whiff punishing are both complex and relatively universal across characters, meaning that to play the game at even a basic level you need to already understand these concepts, and that there are already great resources out there to learn about them. That being said, there are 4 main questions that I try to answer anytime I'm in neutral with Ivysaur, and together they help point me towards the correct option in a given situation. 1. How can my opponent interact with Razor Leaf? 2. What do I need to look out for from my opponent, depending on if they are in the air or on the ground? 3. What angles do I want to attack from? 4. Do I think I will have time to react to my opponent's chosen option in neutral, or will I need to preempt their attack? So let's break down each of these questions and why they're important to our end goal of winning a neutral interaction. First, Razor Leaf is incredibly good at opening up opponents in neutral, but only when used correctly. If Razor Leaf connects with an opponent who isn't ready to clank, avoid, or shield it, it can catch them up and make them easy to hit, making it not only a useful tool when it connects, but a valuable threat without even being thrown out, because it forces a competent opponent to be ready to counterplay it at any time. However, that threat's usefulness can really depend on the character. If your opponent is slow, lacks moves that will easily beat out Razor Leaf, or either doesn't have a projectile or likes to use a projectile that will clank with Razor Leaf and leave them in more end lag than Ivy has from throwing it, then Razor Leaf can be a really useful way to take control of the space between you and your opponent, or bait them into trying to deal with the Leaf in a way that leaves them vulnerable to being attacked directly. However, if you're fighting someone who's capable of throwing out a projectile that will go straight through Leaf, like Samus with her missile, or who can close the space between you and hit not only the Leaf but Ivy as well with an approaching aerial, like Fox, then throwing Leaf becomes less universally useful, since choosing to Leaf while the opponent chooses an option that they already use a considerable amount will lead to you losing the interaction. In these cases, it is important to understand that the threat of Razor Leaf can be just as, or even more, important than actually throwing it, since by threatening to use it, you are forcing your opponent to alter their game plan in order to avoid leaving themselves vulnerable to the projectile. This leads us to our second question, which helps us to narrow down what options we have to look out for from our opponents, depending on whether they're in the air or not. On the ground, they have access to smash attacks, tilts, special moves, and grabs, while in the air they can only access aerials and special moves. In addition, having an opponent in the air means that they can't access other tools like crouch canceling or shielding, opening up more options that you as an Ivysaur player can now use without fear of being punished as easily. Most characters only have a few moves that they'll utilize in neutral in each of these states, which means that when you're thinking about a matchup, you should be able to answer for yourself what offensive or defensive options do you need to worry about from this opponent depending on whether they're in the air or on the ground. These first two questions help us figure out what the pace of neutral should look like, as well as what moves will dictate or change that pace, and the information you get from answering each question will help you figure out the other. The threat of Razor Leaf will change what moves you have to watch out for from your opponent, which then requires you to change if, how, and when you decide to Razor Leaf accordingly. Together, these two questions will help you decide if your goal is to zone your opponent, and if so, how, or if not, what responses you need to make to your opponent's attacks or other neutral options. Then, if you decide that zoning with Razor Leaf, or simply waiting, are not the correct responses to the situation that you're in, the second two questions are how we identify what tools are best suited to playing neutral against the options we've identified. Now let's work through the next two questions using the Captain Falcon matchup as an example. Falcon's neutral air is a move that's commonly used to beat out Razor Leaf while quickly closing space, and is a move that Ivysaur players have to commonly work around in this matchup, since being hit by Nair can lead to a big combo or even death as Ivysaur. Short Hop Nair allows Falcon to approach horizontally, as the move has a decently large hitbox in front of him and comes out at a respectable frame 7. So what does this tell us? Nair is an option that's likely to be thrown out often, specifically because of its utility against Razor Leaf, meaning that Falcon will be jumping in from the distance that an Ivysaur would typically throw Leaf at. The move is fast and hits directly in front of him, but because he's in the air, he cannot access Crouch Cancel or ASDI down to perform counterplay against our multi-hit moves. From this information, we can glean our answer to the second set of questions. We can challenge Falcon's Nair from three main angles, each with their own strengths and weaknesses. We could beat it out diagonally from either above or below, using forward air from above, or either a combination of forward tilt, dash attack, rising neutral air, or pivot grab. We could also challenge it directly horizontally with our back air, which has a disjoint that will cleanly beat out Falcon's Nair. So of these tools, what do we want to pick? Well, that depends on how preemptive we think we need to be in choosing our option here. Of the four options I just named, they are all either relatively slow but with good range, or they're fast but lack the disjoint needed to cleanly beat out Falcon's Nair. This is why we need to be able to answer the fourth question as well. In an ideal world, Falcon would jump from around here, and we would have plenty of time to turn around and back air him, which would stuff his approach. However, if we're too slow to approach, or he mixes up his timing, this isn't a viable response every time. Instead, we need to pick between doing one of two things. We can either preempt his attacks with our own, longer-ranged ones, or catch him with one of our fast moves before his hitbox actually comes out. If you are comfortable calling out his approach ahead of time, pivot grab, full hop fair, or short hop back air would all work great to beat it based on their range and how long the moves are out. But if you're too predictable, then he can simply choose not to nair and instead approach with something else that would allow him to punish those choices that we made. Alternatively, we could wait until the Falcon jumps, and then use one of our fast moves to sneak in and hit him first, beating out the nair using superior frame data rather than superior range. Nair, forward tilt, or dash attack can all serve this purpose if timed and spaced correctly. The same logic and concepts can apply towards beating out a grounded move, like Game & Watch's down tilt. We could challenge it with our dash attack, outrange it with down tilt or grab, or beat it from a different angle by using forward tilt to hit him from above. It's important to remember, though, that when our opponent is on the ground, we have to be much more careful about using moves like back air or nair, which are easily crouch cancelled. But to return to our original example, if we were to focus only on beating out Falcon's Nair, we would no doubt be left vulnerable to being approached with other moves. So before I end this video, I want to describe how the answers to these questions should come together to help us form a more complete game plan. If we are choosing to mostly challenge Nair from below, Falcon might still jump at us, but now come in with down air instead, which has a hitbox that extends below him rather than in front. This would allow him to beat something like our dash attack with ease. Now we can evaluate that down air approach using the same set of questions. As a slower move with a hitbox below it, we now want to emphasize reacting to approaches with moves that will challenge it horizontally, using primarily aerials like Rising Nair or Back Air if we want to challenge it directly at all. Of course, now Falcon will want to mix up which of these approaches he uses, as well as when he uses them in an attempt to make it harder to select the right response for the situation. As you interact with each of the options that Falcon is using, and learn which tools of his will beat or lose to your own options, you can put together a more complete game plan that includes options to deal with each of the ways a Falcon might try to approach or defend against you. This was an extended example, but I hope it illustrates how and why these 4 questions are critical to playing neutral with Ivysaur. The first and second questions help us to identify the situations that we can expect to be confronted with in neutral in any given matchup, and the third and fourth questions help us to decide what tools are best suited to those situations based on what we know. In order to play a competent neutral, you need to be able to consider the multitude of potential approaches that you think are likely from your opponent, and what responses would work against the options or option that you consider most threatening. In turn, they will attempt to approach or defend with their own tools that will beat out or otherwise circumvent the strategies you've been using so far in the game, and you'll need to adjust your game plan accordingly. In the next section of this series, I will be covering Ivysaur's advantage states, which include what to do when your opponents are above you, shielding, or cornered. Please feel free to leave questions in the comments, and I'd be more than happy to answer them or go over any of the concepts from this series in a more in-depth way than I can in the video itself, and you can find a link to the Ivysaur Discord in the description of this video. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for part 2 of this guide coming soon.